Greetings from Paranormal M, your source for the unexplained and the uncanny. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay updated with our latest bone-chilling tales. We hope you have a hauntingly good time listening. Been hearing footsteps every night for the past 3 weeks. This entire thing started nearly 3 weeks ago. I was in bed trying to fall asleep when I start to feel footsteps walk in the hallway right outside my room. Normally I would think this is my dad, so I brushed it off, but they didn't stop. I was able to hear each individual thump and felt the vibrations of the footsteps down at my feet. I can tell when my dad or someone else is walking down the hallway, and based on the vibrations of their footsteps, I know who it is, and if they're walking towards my room or not. So I'm hearing and feeling these footsteps. So I eventually got to sleep, woke up, told my dad. He didn't think much of it. Next night, nothing happened. Second night, the footsteps started again when I got in bed, and I was trying to fall asleep, of course. This time I was trying to think of some reasoning or logic behind why this is happening. So I turn off my box fan. Footsteps are still there. Is it my dog? No, she's in my room tonight sleeping. Could it be my heart pumping blood to my feet? So I changed positions and even stood up. Nope, still there. Maybe the AC unit or pipes in the house. But the pipes and AC and water heater all have individual sound, which I know what they sound like. This, however, sounded exactly like someone walking up and down the hallway, pacing back and forth constantly. The first couple of nights I was absolutely panicked, like crazy when all this was happening. Threw the blanket over my head and I could feel my heart beating as loud as the one in Edgar Allan's poems. A week went by and everything, it was just the same thing. I'd get in bed, and moments later, or even half an hour later, I would hear footsteps and feel the vibrations in my bed. This thing is pacing back and forth, jumping up and down, running, going up the stairs, but it never comes inside my room. More days go by, and it starts to become a nuisance rather than scary. I just wanted to sleep, that was all. But shit got real when 2 nights ago I got in bed and it entered my room, which it had never done before. It was running, making loud thumps on the floor, even pacing back and forth right in front of my bed. Now I was scared. I believe at one point it even tried getting into my bed. I jumped, ran the fuck out of there. Later that night I tried to sleep with the lights on, fan on full blast, and try to sleep with the headband type of a thing. But nope, it still continued. Of course I couldn't see anything with the lights on because nothing is ever there, but I tried a couple of tests. 1. I found out if I leave my fan on, this entity will go nuts and won't shut the hell up. But as soon as I turn the fan off and try to pull out my video recorder on my phone, it goes almost silent. I can still slightly hear it, but my phone can't. The other test is that I learned that if I'm sleeping and I just ignore it, it'll just walk away. But it was weird because every time I would move or change positions in my bed, it would run back up to my bed and then eventually walk away again. I told my dad this next morning, and he said, "This is not normal. You may have a ghost or a demon following you, or Satan's simply teasing you." Then he suggested I make a doctor's appointment. So that's what I did. I set one up for Monday, because this issue is now out of control. My siblings believe I have schizophrenia because auditory hallucinations is a symptom. But this is not a hallucination, because they're as real as anyone else walking down the hallway, and I can feel the footsteps with my own feet. I don't think schizophrenia could do that. I'm out of ideas. I desperately need help. I pray and pray and pray, but these footsteps continue. Story number 2. Saw something crawling in the streets. This experience happened 2 years ago, mid-2018. So I used to almost every weekend on Saturdays go to one of my friends' houses, or have them in mine. We alternate the houses a lot, just to hang out, play games, and drink. We're a big group. Every meeting got about 10 to 15 people, and these meetings used to last until 3 or 4 a.m. on Sunday. I don't do this anymore because I'm working on another city, since 2019. After one of these hangouts in a friend's house, we spent the day playing video games, like FIFA, Tekken, whatever. I left the place around 2 to 3 a.m. Don't remember the exact time. It's pretty far from my home, so I have to drive around 30 minutes to get near where I used to live. On the way home, there's this main street. I have to take a sharp turn to the right to go home. On the right side of this main street is some military forest area with walls and barbed wire. Those kind of things. The turn that I need to take is just at the end of this walked area. The main street continues while I take a turn to the right. While I was doing the turn to the right, I did a glance to the left with the corner of my eye, and I saw something crawling in the middle of the street. Getting goosebumps while writing this. I had 4 members, like a person couldn't be a person. The angle of the articulations was totally not human. Reminded me of like a cricket's leg. I don't know, but I didn't stop the car. I did the turn a bit slow, looking at it, while it was moving. It was moving in a weird way. A bit slow and like it was learning to walk. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't naked. It had some rags that looked like torn old fabric covering the body. It was about 50 to 60 meters away from me. I had a very strange feeling. To this day, I've never had this kind of feeling twice in my life. Just that day, very bad. It was like I was going to die. It stopped moving, like it saw me. I can't tell if it did in fact see me. I couldn't see the face. It had a head, not an animal head with a snout. It was a rounded head, like a human or a monkey. And I'm talking about seconds. The visual contact lasted for like 5, 6 seconds. I don't know. It didn't stop. After the turn, I accelerated the car. I was in shock, almost crying. I looked back a few times until I got home. I stopped the car to open the gate, almost in panic, looking back all the time. Almost dropped the keys. It was late, empty streets all the way, not a single person. I parked the car and got inside home, rushed the stairs, went to my bedroom, and sat on the bed for some time. That image was in my head. It took long to sleep. I still can remember it. I still can see it in my mind. Story number 3. Entities in spirit dimensions feeding off of reactions and emotions. Emotional energy. I went through some big shit lately in life. It all started a couple of years ago. I started meditation and had intense desires to see the spirit realms. I concentrated and analyzed my mind and tried to stop thoughts and tried to remove all emotions. I had addiction for dopamine release. I got off of this habit eventually due to meditation. Gradually, I started seeing another dimension. A mental dimension with plenty of spirits of living and dead. Dead usually don't appear frequently. Lots of living spirits do. Usually these spirits appear in our dreams since our focus is fully on day-to-day activities. We ignore and we just generally reason these away. But these entities are real. They need this energy to survive. They get this energy from sexual activity, positive and negative emotions. Slowly I lost touch with reality. Now these spirits are a pretty common sight. They simply sit beside me, which I can see and sense sometimes. Since they need food, energy, they took control of the brain circuitry that releases these chemicals. Every day this liquid is released in the brain, and these entities feed off of them. They attach themselves to you in another dimension, and feel like I'm losing my mind. They can even trigger your thoughts through feelings. They make your mind to fight with each other. They can direct you to suicidal thoughts too. So I advise anyone to stay away from the spirits and avoid negative energy and addictive behaviors. Keep your mind busy with day-to-day activity or productive thoughts. Avoid places of negativity and conflicts. These spirits are as conscious as humans. They can read your thoughts, motives, and intentions. You cannot be dishonest to them, since they are immaterial consciousness, living besides and within you, knowing everything you do, and predicting your movements and even creating habits within you. Since your mind, your inner dimension, is their home. Story number 4. Had a scary, weird cuddle experience at 1:30 a.m. A little background is that since childhood, I've had my fair share of paranormal experiences, especially while sleeping. I've had one particular entity visit me in my dream for 1 year when I was in a different house. Never seen that entity again when I changed the house in the same area. Stuff like this. But last night I had the weirdest experience of my life. I was sleeping with my wife, and I dreamt that my wife kissed me and went under the blanket. I woke up and sat on the bed with my lower body covered with a blanket. I checked on my wife, but she wasn't in the bed. It was weird. So if my wife was not in the bed, then who kissed me? While I'm thinking about this, a realization that my wife was outside in the living room. Something started moving in the blanket. It was like a snake or a tentacle that started wrapping around my legs. I kid you not, I was freaking out at the same time. Very calm because everything was smooth and non-aggressive. It felt like something was cuddling with my legs. I slapped myself just to make sure I was awake. And I was awake as daylight. Holy smoke, this thing moving and cuddling in the sheets was bloody real. As the thing moved from my thighs to my shins, I literally saw the blankets move with it. That's when I freaked out a little more, but not enough to stop it. I was still curious. I kept sitting on my bed while the thing moved to my shin. I felt it wrap around both my legs and just stay in that position, like a ghost hug. So cute. I moved my foot up and down just to check if it was something like sleep paralysis, but it wasn't. My foot was fine, everything was moving. I was moving. The thing was moving, and I was wide awake. But now it was getting freaky and I had to get out of it. so I slowly pulled the blanket off. Whatever that was that I couldn't see slowly unwrapped and went away. I got up, went to my wife, told her the story, and came back to bed. Woke up the next morning and here I am, still freaked out, hoping it was an act of love by whatever and nothing else. I lived in a haunted apartment for 14 years. As the title says, I lived in an apartment with at least one ghost in it for 14 years. I still don't know exactly what it was, but I'm fairly certain it wasn't my guardian angel. Since I've lived there for most of my life, from age 7 to 21, I have a lot of experiences to share. And because of this, I'll only share the big ones for this post. The apartment was fairly small. A small entrance area, one bathroom, one kitchen, one living room, and one bedroom, and a small hallway that connected the living room and bedroom with a closet in it. My mother, sister, and I lived there, and we all shared the bedroom and had our own beds. Most of these happened while I was home alone, though, because why wouldn't they? I was 7 years old the first time I encountered it, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was up early for school at 6 a.m., got dressed, and decided to take a quick nap on the living room couch before I left. I laid on the couch, my back facing out to the living room. I fell asleep. I woke up and rolled over, face outwards toward the living room, sat up, stretched, and yawned, then opened my eyes to look at the clock. 6:42 a.m. I then looked towards the doorway leading into the kitchen, and the entire world stopped for me. In the doorway was a silhouette of a man. He, or rather it, was as tall as the doorway, and was the deepest and most pure black I've ever seen. He stared at me with glowing red eyes, his gaze full of hate and malice. You may think being paralyzed with fear is just a horror trope, but it is a very real experience. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, yet I couldn't. I couldn't even form tears. I was staring into his eyes, his into mine. We kept this gaze for what felt like hours. In reality, it must have been a few seconds. I managed to blink, and just like that, he was gone. Every conceivable emotion after seeing that came flooding in all at once. I didn't know what that was, but I knew I needed to get out. Of course, I had to run through the exact doorway to leave, but I sprinted through it, down the stairs, and out the building. I remember getting in trouble that day because I left my bag, and no one believed me when I told them what happened. My family didn't believe me, and after a few more happenings, they said to stop talking about it because it wasn't real. My next experience happened in 5th grade, so I was about 11. This one happened in the bedroom. My bed was positioned so that you could see most of it, while the small hallway quite possibly was the worst place for it to be, considering what happened. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. Nothing felt particularly off, but I was pretty thirsty. I turned over and I was about to get out of my bed to get a glass of water. Take a guess at who was standing in the hallway. I could still see his silhouette clearly, despite the entire house being pitch black. His red eyes glowed even brighter than before, and he was staring directly at me. I started breathing and sweating heavily. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't even make a sound. I remembered the other time I saw him, and I remembered that he went away after I blinked. So I blinked. But this time, he didn't go away. He got closer. He was halfway in the hallway before, but now he was in the doorway. I felt like I was going to throw up my whole stomach. I blinked again, he got closer. maybe 6 feet from me, staring at me the whole time. I blinked one more time and he was gone. I was relieved until I heard footsteps. The house was old, so the floors creaked when anyone walked on them. I heard creaking from where he was, and I heard steps leading up to my bed, each step paired with the creak of the floorboards. Couldn't take my eyes off the floor. They'd reached the side of my bed and stopped. One more step, and he would have been right in front of my face. Something in my head was screaming at me not to look up, or to get out of bed. I still can't explain it, but I just knew something would happen if I did the wrong move. I decided to act like I didn't just see a shadow teleport across my room, and ignored it. I kept my gaze down, rolled over, hid underneath the covers. I didn't sleep that night, nor did I hear any more footsteps. Last one for this post, and this one stuck with me the most. This one happened in December, after I graduated high school in 2016. By this time, I know I've had ghosts in my house. I kinda got used to their shenanigans. They still spooked me, but nothing too bad. I want to point out there might have also been a little girl. I would sometimes smell rose perfume, and I thought I saw someone with pigtails out of the corner of my eye once. For this one, I was in the kitchen getting ready to go to work. I put the little cup into the Keurig and went to sit at the table to eat my toast. I was watching Dashi on YouTube with the earbud in my left ear in. That morning it was very windy, and the whole building swayed a bit with heavy gusts of wind. The first 2 big gusts shook up the house as normal. The third gust is when it happened. The house shook as normal, and from the living room, clear as day, I heard a little girl scream. This wasn't some scream you'd hear when kids play. This girl was screaming bloody murder. It sounded almost exactly like it does in movies. I stopped mid-bite of my toast, had tears rolling down my face, wanted to get out of that house as quickly as I could. But I only had pants on. My clothes were in the room, so I had to fucking walk through that goddamn living room twice. I gathered my thoughts and decided I'd briskly walk through with my phone in my face and headphones in, grab my clothes in my room and get out. After a quick pep talk, a string of obscenities, I went to the living room. As I walked through the living room, I saw someone sitting on my couch out of the corner of my eye. It took everything in me to not lose my shit or look out of curiosity. I got into the room and picked up whatever clothes my hand touched, walked swiftly back to get out. On my second trek through the living room, they moved from the couch to standing right by the side of the hallway entrance. I still had my phone right up to my face, but my goddamn peripheral vision saw their face looking right up at me. There was no language that could describe the feelings I had in that moment. They said something. I don't know what the scary cunt said, but I ignored whatever it was and bolted out, flew down the stairs. Sorry for the C word, guys. I changed outside and went to work. I stayed at my friend's house that week. Thankfully, we moved 2 years ago. Haven't had anything like that happen here. It's one thing, but mostly unrelated. As I said earlier, I have a lot more tales to tell, but these were definitely in the top 5. I'll share more if you guys want. I just didn't want to post a novel. I think it was a shade individual. I don't like saying the actual word for it, but I'd love to know more. Anytime I would look into it, I got that feeling of being watched, stopped. Haven't had the urge to research it since then. Glowing green eyes. I was 12 or 13 years old, and my family and I went to my cousin's house in Oregon. He lived in a pretty big house, secluded on lots of land. It was surrounded by trees, but from the house, it About 50 yards, there were no trees. The first floor of my cousin's house is all windows, so you essentially have a 360-degree view of the whole area. Well, during our stay there, my cousin and I decided that we would wake up at 3 a.m. and go down into his basement to play video games. His room is on the second floor of the house. 3 a.m. comes around, and his alarm wakes us up. He and I get up and begin to go down the stairs to head to the basement. As we get to the first floor, the floor that's all windows, I notice a pair of giant glowing green eyes outside of one of the windows, staring at me. I stood there frozen as I could feel it staring at me down. My cousin saw them too, and rather than running back upstairs, he went to the basement. I noped right out of there, and I went back upstairs where I fell back asleep. I woke up a few hours later, when it was light out, and went back downstairs. The eyes were gone at this point. I went down to the basement where my cousin was, and he was playing games. I asked him why he didn't go back upstairs, and he said it's because he always sees them, and his parents didn't believe him, so he just ignores them now. To this day, I always think about those eyes. Creeps me out still. A little more background. The moon wasn't out. It was extremely cloudy, but there was enough light out to where you could make out shapes and objects in the house. Where the eyes were, there were no bushes or trees. It wouldn't have had to been way up too high for a mountain lion to be. The only way I think it could have been a mountain lion is if it was standing straight up on its rear end legs. I also checked the area where the eyes were footprints or something maybe like that could cause some sort of reflection, with no luck. My cousin also said the eyes weren't always in the same spot. The eyes were like glow stick green with no other colors on them. They didn't emit light, meaning there was no green tint inside the house, but they were super bright. Gives me the chills as I type this. Hopefully you all got some insight from me, as I've been thinking about this lately. Something sinister I can't explain. I live in a small terraced house and have done all my life. My house is around 150 years old and was lived in during both world wars, and many bombs were dropped around the area. I'm saying that as I don't know if that could be a significant detail or not. One of the first things I ever experienced was when I was 5. This story was recalled to me by my parents and their friend, who was there at the time. According to my parents, they're very spiritual and believe in the paranormal very much, so wouldn't make something like this up. I was playing in the back room and I was stood staring into the cupboard underneath the stairs. This cupboard was filled with coats and shoes. My mother asked me what I was doing. I replied, "Speaking to the little boy. He's sad because he's lost his mummy." My mother continued to ask me what he looked like. I pulled a face where my eyes were dragged down and my mouth was very drooped. This obviously creeped my parents out a lot, although I don't remember anything about that event myself. I knew that my parents don't lie about things like this. The next thing that happened, I vividly remember, as it only stopped a few years ago. Both me and my younger brother experienced this often. We would be sat in our rooms doing whatever we were doing, and then we would have our names shouted, but it didn't sound like either of our parents. And when we asked them why they shouted for us, they would say that they didn't. Also, we live in a terraced house. Our neighbors couldn't have been shouting us, because our neighbor to the left was Polish and didn't even speak English, and our other neighbors didn't know our names. Plus, my brother has a very unusual name. It was only recently that me and my parents made a possible link between the two occurrences. My parents are genuinely concerned of what would have happened if they had gone towards this voice shouting for us. There's been a lot of other things happening, including footsteps, growls, and whispers, but most of them, bar the growls, occurred after my grandfather's passing a few years ago. We put these things down to our grandfather trying to communicate with us. Seeing dead great-grandfather, and him predicting me and my siblings. I was about 6 or 7 when this happened, but I was staying at my dad's for the weekend, and I had this weird dream that I was in my dad's old apartment, when my parents hadn't separated yet. I was looking at the door entrance of the apartment, and I saw this random old guy that I'd never seen before. He just stood there for a minute. Then a figure in a black robe phases through him and goes straight at me. Then I wake up. The next morning I'm looking at the pictures that my grandma had around the house, and I see a picture and the old man is in it with my grandma. So I asked my dad who this was. He told me it was his grandpa, who basically raised my dad, because my dad's parents also divorced. And he told me that he would have loved to meet me, and my siblings too. So the confused kid that I was asks another question. Dad, where is he? And to that my dad replied, he died before your older brother was born. I told him about my dream, and he was surprised, but I remember my dad shedding a tiny tear in his face. But that's not even the crazy part. Years pass and I'm 13. I never really knew anything about my great-grandpa, so I asked my dad some questions about him. And my dad told me some funny stories and great life lessons, but I remember him saying this. Did I ever tell you that he predicted you and your siblings before you guys were even born? I hear that and I call bullshit. But he tells me that he and Mom visited him in the hospital once. This is years before he died. And when they walk in, they see him with a curious face, and my great-grandpa asks them, where are the kids? My parents were dating for about 2 years now, and don't have any kids, so they tell him, what kids? He responds, there was 2 boys playing together and a little girl playing with a doll. My parents are weirded out because they both knew damn well they didn't have kids yet, so they blew it off. 2002 comes. My great-grandpa dies. My older brother's born. Then 2004 comes around and I'm born. Then 2008, little sister's born. I never got to meet him, but I always hope I could see him one day. The voice my sister and I heard when we were playing at my dad's coworker's house. This happened years ago when I was about 9. My little sister would have been about 5. My whole family, my mom, my dad, my older sister, my older brother, myself, my younger sister, and my younger brother were at my dad's coworker's house outside of town. Because we were pretty young, my parents had us be outside for most of the day. The family had this playground in their backyard that we were playing in, but their kids were grown, adults, and out of the house too, so it was a bit run down. The playground has wooden stairs that led up to there as a square walkway, all the way around to the top, and in the center was an enclosure that had windows all around it, and a door that locked from the outside. It was full of a bunch of seemingly random junk to us kids, but it was still interesting. At one point in the day, my older brother had locked me in it. I flipped out because I'm extremely claustrophobic. Even though this enclosure was full of windows, I only mention being locked in because it's important for the main part of this experience. Mind you, There were no houses close by. The yard was fenced in, a chain-link fence, so you could see everything, and a single tree between the house and the playground. The yard was huge and bare otherwise, as far as I can remember. When my older brother and sister had gone inside after some time, it was just me and my younger sister at the playground. My little brother was like a year old, so he had been inside with my parents the whole time. I was at the bottom of the stairs that led up to the enclosure, and my little sister was standing outside the enclosure by the door. She wanted to go into it, but since my brother had locked me in it previously, she looked over at the railing at me and said, "Don't lock me in." And I was gonna say, "I won't," but some voice that sounded like a really loud whisper coming from all around me beat me to it and said, "I won't." But some voice that sounded like a really loud whisper. I've said that before. My sister's eyes got wide, freaked out, and I ran inside crying. I quickly followed suit and ran away towards the house. I reached the only tree in the yard on the way back to the house and turned around to see if anyone else was there and yelled, "Who is that? Who said that?" I still don't see anybody, but the voice answered, "I did." It was the same voice, and it still sounded like it was coming from all around me, like it was whispering into both my ears at the same time. I ran inside to find my whole family and the owners of the house sitting on the couch in the living room, and my little sister was hiding underneath the coffee table crying. My parents were initially mad at me for scarring her, perhaps scaring, but she kept telling them that it wasn't me, and we both told them what happened. My parents insisted that everybody had been inside with them when it happened. The owners of the house and my parents spent a large part of the day trying to figure out what had happened. But ultimately, we never did. We never went near that playground again, though. My sister and I still bring it up from time to time. She doesn't like talking about it, but definitely still remembers it. It was one of the creepiest things I've ever experienced. Pretty long game. 20 years ago, I dated a guy, Mick, for almost a year. I thought he was the sun and the stars, and while I was very devoted to him, he wasn't a very good boyfriend to me. He strung me on and played with my emotions in an almost sadistic way. He cheated on me and always talked me into taking him back. I was a very young single mom without any place to belong, so I guess I was desperate and tolerated far too much. The night my grandpa got sick and passed away was the first family death I'd experienced, and I wasn't on good terms with my family at the time. I needed to be with somebody that I thought cared about me and would just let me cry and work through it. Mick lived about an hour away from me as a roommate to my best friend and her husband, so naturally it was the place that I went. I spoke to him off and on all day. After my grandpa was taken away by the funeral home and things were done for the day, I let him and my friend know that I was coming, and I needed to be with the people that cared. They all knew I was coming, and he disappeared without telling anybody that he was leaving. It was ghosting before ghosting was a thing. I found out later that he had another girlfriend for about 3 months and was playing games with us both. He stopped answering my calls and never came back that night. I cried until I fell asleep on their couch, just waiting on him to show up. After a few hours of sleep, I gave up, drove the hour back home to my own apartment. We only had one other conversation. The next week after the funeral, an obligatory family thing, I gathered all of his stuff and asked my friend to gather up mine. I took him the box of his belongings and exchanged it while he was at work. There was one item I kept, a sweatshirt with his fraternity on the front and some snarky bullshit about his big brother on the back. I only kept it because he repeatedly said how important it was to him. That was a shitty, spiteful move, but all is fair and all that. I was a very young, immature, scorned, heartbroken girl. Our conversation was brief and consisted of him begging for his sweatshirt while I laughed, saying I didn't have to, and I didn't even have it, and I had no idea where it could be. Since we were still connected to some of the same social circles, I got to hear through the grapevine that he was still mad and ranting about that sweatshirt for several years. For a while, that small bit of petty bitterness would be tickled, and I would get satisfaction from knowing that he was still salty. Over a sweatshirt. Eventually, that bitterness all disappeared, and those memories were stored in the back corner of my mind. As it does, life went on. Careers and family grew and changed. Kids grew up and moved away. Before you know it, 20 years have passed you by. This is the first Christmas in a decade that my husband and I are not traveling. As dusk approached on Christmas Eve night, I got a weird feeling. I felt like something supernatural was going on in my normally quiet house. I had weird feelings of being watched, catching things move and just things in the corner of my eye. Cold spots. You know what I mean. You could just feel it. I blessed the house, lit a candle, said a prayer, did my best to set things right in my house and in my head. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, right? After midnight, I was nestled in bed, listening to my meditation podcast, trying to fall asleep, but I kept feeling something on my feet. It felt like a cat moving on the end of the bed, but he was right next to me. After the third instance, I shot straight up in bed. I sleep with a dim light on so I could see there was nothing in my room or on my bed. Now I was spooked and on high alert. I know something touched my feet. I listened for a while, and just when I started falling back to sleep, I hear two very loud knocks on my closet door. The cat even heard it. We both had hair standing on end. Then from inside the closet, it sounded like something crashed. Something heavy. Not going to react that. Assuming the closet collapsed from the weight of my fabulous shit. I mustered my courage, got up, turned on every light in the bedroom, and opened the closet. All of my sweaters and folded clothes from the very top shelf had been swept off and were lying in the floor on top of my shoes. Shit I never wear or look at. Mostly expensive sweaters that are a decade out of style, but too valuable to get rid of. They were still folded, so I picked them up and got the step stool and put them all back up on the top shelf. I washed my face, got a drink of water, saged the bedroom, went back to bed, where I quickly fell back asleep. On Christmas Day, I received a phone call from my best friend. We chatted briefly about the kids and Christmas when she actually called to tell me that Mick passed away from aggressive pancreatic cancer the evening before. I let her talk for a while before I interrupted her to ask, "Wait, Mick who?" She confirmed, and I just shook my head in disbelief. How could this be? We're all in our early 40s, way too young for cancer. She explained that she would be going back home for his graveside service, and I was welcome to go with her if I wanted. I politely declined because of how things ended back then and how uncomfortable it would be to see his family after all this time. I wished them peace, but it wasn't my place to give them comfort. Before I could finish my sentence and end our conversation, there were two loud knocks on my closet door again. I found the clothes in the exact same position as the night before, swept off the top shelf, laying in a neatly folded stack on the floor. Just like the night before, right on top of the stack was Mick's old faded fraternity sweatshirt. I've since folded the shirt and tied it with a decorative ribbon. My friend will pick it up on her way out of town to give it to his mother at the graveside. Until then, I can only hope that giving it back will finally set the universe right, and I will patiently wait for the knocking to stop. Weird experience at a hotel. This is from 2013. I travel a lot for work. I mean, before COVID. And when I do, I stay at hotels. Sleeping in a different bed doesn't bother me, as I'm mostly a sound sleeper and I'm used to it, given that I've been doing this for a while. This was a hotel in the suburbs of Chicago, a city in the US for non-American listeners. From the time I checked into the room, I think it was maybe room 413, I think. I've never felt such a sense of dread, despair, and claustrophobia. I am a rational person, no history of depression. So I explained it to myself that maybe the 13 in the room number was messing with me. But I've stayed in other hotels with a 13 in my assigned room. I had also stayed at this same property every week over the last few months, but I had never felt this. I pondered lying in bed if I should call the front desk, ask for another room. I don't know what excuse I'd give to the front desk. Everything was great with the room, the shower was great, room was spotless, the toilet had no issues. A boring, predictable, clinically consistent room like any other Marriott property. No complaints on the Wi-Fi. I couldn't bring myself to lie to the front desk and ask to be changed to another room. So I told myself I was a rational man, a husband, a father, and a protector. I recall the monologue I had in my head. Don't be a whiny little bitch, be a man. I decided I was going to stay put. The uneasiness didn't lessen, so I turned on every light in the room, took out all the Bibles from the bedstand, and set them next to me. I'm not of Christian faith, and not a very religious person either. But I felt that I kind of needed all the protection I could, so I played chants on loop on YouTube from my own religion all night at a low volume and went to sleep. I woke up in the morning, worked out, showered. Went to work the night's experience. Felt like a fleeting memory during the day. I had a really fun rental that week. A Mustang GT. It was so much fun. The night's memory felt imaginary. Came back from work that evening, feeling a little bit silly about the night before, and went back to the room. And in an instant, the same sense of unexplained dread and claustrophobia came flooding back. What the fuck? I just couldn't rationally explain it. So I went back to the routine from the night before. Lights on, chanting on, Bible, Marriott Mormon Bible, all by the bed. Next evening, I spoke with the bartender and asked him if he had heard any weird complaints. He said he hadn't, but he'd ask around. When I came back the next week, I got a different room. Woo! But I checked in with the bartender. He said he had done a little digging over the weekend and picked up on gossip from other hotel staff that some of the cleaning ladies didn't like that room, and even that corner of the whole 4th floor. He was intrigued enough that he brought along a sensitive quote-unquote friend from his Episcopalian church, and he said that when she opened the door and had barely taken a step inside, she just about made a 180 degree and came right out. She couldn't even go inside the room. She said it felt heavy. The bartender said that was enough to spook him. He said he just stood in the corridor and wouldn't go in himself. Kinda had a laugh about it, but deduced to Google. So he Googled up the property address to see if there were any documented murders, suicides, things like that. Didn't come across anything. The property that changed hands a few times was a nearby fire with some deaths, but nothing notable in the Google searches. I didn't think much of it. But I've stayed at more than 2,000 nights in hotels since the fall of 2013, and I'm yet to experience that fear ever again. I continue to rethink about the memory of my experience, trying to recount details about the room, that week, maybe even my mood at work, just so I could find something rational to explain what I felt. And I have been unable to. I came across the subreddit and figured I'd post if you had any insights into what might have been happening that I was experiencing. I predicted my stepbrother's death, and he is haunting my family. Back in June, my stepbrother passed away while on assignment with the Air Force. He was only 21 and a few weeks away from 22. He wasn't sick or anything, and we still don't know much about his death. My experiences. Ever since the first day he joined, he left for boot camp, and it was when the dreams of his death started. They weren't common until I got a job at a restaurant that he used to work at, and about 3 months before his death. I quit the job in April, and the dreams stopped until June 2nd, and on June 3rd. Since then, I don't have any dreams anymore. I just fall asleep and just wake up. Now, the dreams were pretty different except for one detail. I always learned about his death on the news. Now, on the morning of June 3rd, I was on Reddit. Scrolling through my page there was a post about an airman found dead in his room. I felt like I knew it was him, but the post didn't give any names, so I shrugged it off until my mom called to share the news herself. It was him. Now, all of my dreams always shared the fact that I learned it from a news source, followed by my mom calling me. Haven't had a single dream since, until last week where I'm dreaming about my cousin dying. My family. My mom's always been a believer of the afterlife and spirits. She swore that she saw angels and spirits physically watching over me when I was in the ER several times. It all started 3 weeks after he died. We were having issues bringing his body back due to the fact that he was overseas and the government was in COVID lockdown. They couldn't send a coroner up to check on the body. My mom was woken up at 3 a.m. to loud knocking from her room. Something that never happens in our house. It's less than 10 years old. She looks and sees her phone is ringing on silent. It's the Air Force, saying that they're sending him home despite the local government saying no, and his autopsy is going to take place in the same hospital where my stepdad was born. After she hung up the phone, she asked, "Stepbrother's name, was that you?" And one soft but noticeable knock was heard from right behind her. She wasn't the only one hearing the knock. On the week of the funeral, we had family come up and stay with us, and every family member who stayed the night at that house heard some form of knocking near their beds. On top of that, my mom and stepdad would keep hearing my stepbrother's old room door slam and drums playing, his favorite instrument to play, even though the drums are in a storage unit. I since moved out shortly before he passed, so I haven't experienced anything other than my last post here. As requested, the time I think I sensed an angry, godlike being. So it was about a year ago or so that this happened. I worked at Walmart. I lived about 45 minutes away from my store. I was out in the boonies. I still live there, but I don't work right now. One night I was coming home from work around 11. I finally pulled up to my gate. My house is far from the road, and it has a long, winding driveway that takes you through some trees, but it starts out as a big open spot at the roadside. So like any other night, I got out of my car to get the gate. But for some reason, the instant I did, I I felt my skin crawling like crazy. For some reason, something in the back of my mind was telling me that I was being watched. I tried to dismiss it as I unlocked and opened the gate. But then when I got back into my car, I felt safe again. By this point, I was dreading getting back out, but I had to close the gate behind me, so I did. But I looked around at everything, every bit of fence, every bush, every nearby tree. Nothing. By this point, I was full-on freaking out. Something was watching me, and I didn't know what the hell it was. As I finished closing the gate, I got a weird thought that whatever it was above me, which was stupid, since above me there was nothing but clear night sky. I could see all the way across the pasture with nothing but moonlight, and there was nothing above me. But just to try to quell that doubt, I looked up to see if anything was there and see if anything seemed off. For some reason, my eyes were drawn to a certain point in the sky. There was nothing there, not even a constellation, not a plane, nothing. But for some reason, the instant I saw this patch of sky, every alarm bell in my head went off. I looked away from it, but I could still feel whatever it was staring at me from above.
Stop it, birds.
The best way I can describe it is that staring at that point in the sky felt the same way as falling into water that you can't see the bottom of. It was huge. Only whatever it was, it did not seem happy that I could feel it. I just felt this intense hate coming from that point in the sky, and every single red flag in my brain was raised, as if I was in mortal danger. So I did what any sensible person would do. Got in my car, drove down the driveway and sprinted into the house where I felt safe again. I don't know if my life was in danger that night, but whatever this thing was, felt as if God himself was staring me directly in the eyes, and he wanted me gone. Thankfully, I haven't felt it since. So yeah, I won't be answering any questions about what I think it was. To be honest, after the warnings I've gotten, I don't want to know anymore. Some things are better left unnamed and unseen, and I think this is one of those things. My encounter with what I think might have been a demon. Back a couple of years ago, I was into a pretty bad argument with a friend. Sorry guys, my bird is going nuts. Got into a pretty bad argument with a friend. In short, I'd been keeping a secret and had come clean about it. She was really mad, and I went to bed feeling like shit. Of course, I'll admit I've had some issues with mental health, like depression. My family doesn't have a good track record with mental health either. But I'd never experienced anything like this before. About halfway through the night, I woke up. I think it was a dream. Again, I think. I was sitting upright in my bed, holding a specific knife I actually owned in my hand. I looked around and my room was illuminated by particularly bright moonlight. This was odd since my curtains were closed, but it didn't feel off. I looked at a part of my wall that the light was illuminating quite brightly and saw words written in some kind of paint. I don't want to say blood because that sounds cheesy, but that's honestly what it looked like. The words were, "Kill yourself," written in what looked like blood. Sounds stupid, but that's what it looked like. As dumb as it sounds, I feel that those are common demonic tropes for a reason. The trope had to start somewhere, right? I should add, I'd never once self-harmed or even really considered suicide at that point, despite my depression. Anyway, when I read those words, it all felt like it clicked. I held the knife up to my wrists, and I was about to start cutting, when something caught my eye in a dark corner of my room. I squinted to get a better look. I realized it was somewhat humanoid. It looked absolutely terrifying. had these eyes and teeth that looked like those of a deep-sea fish. Think Gollum mixed with a human and an anglerfish's mouth. Not pleasant. When I saw it, the light in the room suddenly went from moonlight to flickering orange as if there was a fire behind me illuminating my room. I ended up bolting upright a few minutes before my alarm in a cold sweat. I figured that's just a creepy nightmare, so I just got up, went to school. My skin was crawling the whole drive there. I get out my first class and I start getting anxious, so I reach up to touch my cross necklace. As I do, a voice that isn't mine speaks in my head and says, "God won't save you." For the next few months, I had these incidents where basically it would feel like some outside force would jump on me and want me to kill myself at the slightest negative happening. I tried to face this feeling by picking up the knife to prove I could resist, but the instant that I picked up the knife, it felt like I couldn't put it down. Eventually, I managed to put it back in my drawer, and I didn't touch it until I had an accident in a while. The incident stopped after I went outside during one family was in the house, and firmly told the demon it would leave. By the power of Jesus, it would leave. I honestly feel like I'm lucky that I remembered that part of the Bible, because I think it worked. That was my last incident, and it sort of ended after I told the demon to fuck off. I don't know if that's what made it go away, or if it just lost interest after I wouldn't kill myself. So yeah, that's my demon story. I actually went looking online a while back to see what I was dealing with, and I found an East Asian demon that seemed like it fit the description. A human goblin thing with sharp teeth that finds people at low points, tries to convince them to kill themselves. Honestly, if it weren't for the fact that I saw this thing illuminated in what looked like hellfire, I would just assume it was the depression. But whatever it is, it's gone now. I haven't had a single incident in it's got to be over 3 years at this point. I was 17, and I'm 20 now. The Little Girl with the Stuffed Bear. I've always been in tune with spirits since childhood, mainly seeing apparitions or feeling energies and silhouettes. This encounter was when I was in my 3rd year of university. I moved into a new student rental, the basement of the building. The house was nice, new and in a quaint neighborhood a distance away from the university. Shortly after moving in, I felt like I was being watched. My room was in a corner of the basement, adjacent to 2 hallways, one that led to the living space and the other that led to the entrance and furnace area. I didn't feel threatened. Over time, I would see an apparition of a little girl. She wore a white dress, had shoulder-length hair, but her bangs covered her face, which I couldn't see well. Sometimes I'd see her with a stuffed bear. Normally, the encounters would be, I might walk from my bedroom to the bathroom to see her silhouette move from one room to another, as if she was curiously watching me. Fast forward about 3 months. One weekend, I'm back in my hometown visiting my family. My mom, who is very in tune with spirits, pulls me aside to talk to me. She said that she knows I'm being followed and that the spirit is passing by, quote unquote, but is attracted to my energy. I already felt no harm, so I thought that was kind of cool. My mom suggested one night I try and talk to her to see if, what she was all about. While I returned to my student place, I started talking aloud before going to bed. She was the most active, by the way, saying if she feels comfortable, she can come out, and I won't be harmful or anything. Another month goes by, and one night I'm studying for a math exam the next day. It was getting late, so I head to bed. Now, I've always heard that if you awake between 3 or 4, that tends to be the dead hour. Fast forward, it's around 4. I wake up, which is normally unusual for me, but it was different tonight. When I awoke, I was on my side and my vision was aligned with the wall beside my bed. I left the lamp on, since I was just too exhausted to turn everything off from studying, so I saw a shadow cast on the wall, clear as day, as if someone was standing behind me. Now, I had roommates, but I wasn't close. They were grad students, and it was the summer, so I was usually alone in the house when I was there. I turn around and I see the girl. This time, she's fully realized she wasn't a transparent apparition. It was as if she was living and breathing, just a girl. I saw her white dress, her teddy bear held in her left hand, and she was looking at me. A peaceful smile. I saw her face for the first time. She was indeed a young girl. She quickly disappeared as soon as I awoke. It was my first time seeing a spirit to this intensity and being up so close with one. I screamed, not out of fright, but out of being startled. After that, I never saw her again. I suspect I may have scared her off since she was timid to begin with. I felt really bad since I wanted to explore this more, but she was nice company for the time that she was around. Spirits following my family since my mother was a child. My family has collectively had many experiences with the paranormal. It mostly starts with my mom at age 5, when she saw a shadow man in the 20s style suit and a fedora hat into her church during a service. She asked her youth pastor and teacher who that man was. Her teacher responded that there was nothing there. The shadow stayed for 15 minutes and got agitated when the pastor began to pray. My mom, who is now age 51, will still occasionally see this fedora man. 2 incidents when I was 14 or 15. Each a separate night. One night I was in bed, and I felt like someone used both hands open palm to smack my feet hard under my blanket. It made me shoot. It made me shoot up, I guess, thinking that it was my brother messing with me. Everyone was asleep in the house. Another time at the same location, I saw a tall, lanky, misshapen shadow figure at my door swaying. My room was so dark I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, but this shadow was darker than the room. The last most memorable incident was when I was a senior in high school. I was watching a jazz documentary in percussion class. There were a total of 7 students, plus our band teacher in a large band room, spread out, watching in the dark. I was the only one in the chair due to a broken foot that I was alleviating because the teacher who was on the other side of the room told him so. 4 classmates were with him, while 2 others were sitting on each side of me on the floor. The floor had levels, so if you kind of sit on them like sitting on a stair. 2 feet behind me were hanging chimes. In the middle of the documentary, the chimes smashed together loudly like someone full force swatted them. My first thought was to look for someone, but everyone was in their spots and the 2 boys beside me never moved. I was able to see them constantly with my peripherals. The chimes had been standing up straight and not caught on anything since I had checked them earlier. They were moved to abruptly that. They were still swaying when we all turned to look. Let's just say everybody was uncomfortable after that. The Lady in the Purple Dress. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, my grandmother from my father's side took me to a relative's house in the countryside, where a family reunion would take place. I remember it being a very elegant yet antique structure, with a cobblestone base and a tall mahogany wall. To be honest, everything seemed tall at that time, because it was indeed taller than me. The house itself was built next to a lake, which was so deep in certain spots that the water looked like a portal to a void, black, seemingly empty. I, who was always excited at the sight of a body of water and the possibilities of being able to play in it, stared deeply at that lake. Ignoring the scary-looking water, I immediately started to get ready to go for a swim. I think I was the first one ready, actually. As the rest of my family got ready, I ran towards the lake shore and slowly dipped my foot into the water. To this day, I still remember the way it felt. In contrast to the ever-hot tropical weather, this lake felt like a tundra. It didn't just feel like the cold feeling of a breezy winter night. It was the type of cold that one feels when in a state of absolute terror. The feeling crawled up my legs and up into my spine, and I slowly walked into the lake, water enveloping me. As I walked, I could feel the wet, slimy rocks beneath my feet, threatening to betray my step at any moment. When the water hit my waist, their threats became a promise, and I slipped and fell fully into the water. I panicked as water went into my mouth and nose and quickly opened my eyes underneath the water to process what had just happened. The panic increased as my lungs started to fill with water. I swallowed what seemed to be a gallon of water before I felt a hand grab me and firmly pull me up. My grandmother stared back at me with a mix of fright, shock, and relief at the same time. She scolded me for trying to act grown and not waiting for the adults to accompany me. I coughed up water as she carried me out of the lake and into the house. We went inside a random room that had a bathroom attached, and she set me down on a tall sink counter, which was situated right in front of the bathtub. Still scolding me, she told me to stay still and left me all by myself for a moment. I heard her exit the room and close the door. Tears started pouring from my eyes from the scare of almost drowning and my even bigger fright of disappointing my grandmother. How unlucky was I to almost drown in waist-deep water and risk a spanking on top of that? Not very, not in the least. My luck deteriorated even further when the weight of me leaning forward to wipe my tears and rub my eyes made me fall from the counter. Even at that age, I knew I would either die or be seriously injured. Time slowed down to a crawl as I saw the edge of the bathtub get closer and closer. My head was an egg about to get cracked open. I closed my eyes, waiting for the impact. But it never came. The smell of fresh lavender emerged suddenly, like a soft mist. The feeling of soft satin fabric pressing against me feeling comforting. The touch of a woman's delicate hand made my eyes open in surprise. Her mocha-colored face was detailed beautifully by wrinkles. Her dark eyes were kind and motherly. She felt cold, but a comfortable kind of cold, like the cool side of a pillow. We stared into each other's eyes for what seemed like a lifetime. I could sense something was wrong with her, though. Despite being pressed against her torso, I never felt it rise nor fall. I never felt a heartbeat. Despite our faces being so close together, I never felt the gentle air of her exhale. Now that I think about it, she looked more like a wax figure than a person. The same expression locked on her face even after I said thank you. Slowly, she kneeled and set me down on the floor on my rear. And just as suddenly as she was there, she disappeared. I stayed still on the floor, still looking in the place that she was. When my grandmother came back and saw me on the floor, she freaked out. There was no way I would have been able to hop off the counter without injuring myself in some way. With a smile, I explained to her what happened. I told her about the nice lady and how she saved me. I could sense her confusion and watched her purse her lips, getting ready to say something, and then pausing. After composing herself a bit, she said, "There's nobody wearing a purple dress in the house." Then I learned the reason why we went to the lake house in the first place. A remembrance ceremony. Among the bouquets of lavender flowers, I saw a picture that made me freeze. It was the lady in the purple dress. She had been dead for 10 years. She drowned in the lake, and her favorite flowers were lavender. They buried her in her favorite purple dress. The Last Goodbye. From about 8 years old, I've always seen things, but my parents assumed it was just my imagination. I suppose they were right to an extent, as I did have a very active imagination, which is kind of what brought me closer to my Uncle Harry. Now, Uncle Harry, for as long as I could remember, was bedridden, and he couldn't really speak. But nonetheless, every time we would visit my Aunt Grace, his wife and I would find myself, or his wife, would find myself talking to him and playing games. I always had fun when we went to visit, much to the discomfort of my sister and other cousins who found him creepy. I can't blame them, we were all so little and had never been exposed to someone so ill before. As time had passed, we visited less as my uncle was getting worse as the years went on, and the fact that we now lived about 2 hours away made it difficult to visit at all. My sister and I had just started 3rd grade at a brand new school. Now, since we went to a Catholic elementary school, we would line up in the hallways against the walls to perform the end-of-day prayer. During the lineup, I was positioned in front of the band room, which had a large glass window on the door. I turned to look into the room and I saw my Uncle Harry in an all-white suit, sitting in one of the chairs. I waved to him and he waved back, and I turned around as the bell had rung for dismissal. My sister and I met my mom in the cafeteria where students picked us up, or where student pickup was, I think they meant. And we began to walk out when I stopped my mom. I told her that we couldn't leave, and she asked me why. I told her because Uncle Harry was here, and we couldn't leave him. I assumed he came with my mom to pick us up from school. My mom looked at me very confused and said, Uncle Harry was back home with my Aunt Grace. I fought her all the way home about this and described what I saw. She didn't want to listen. We arrived home and the phone was ringing. My mom answered the phone. It was my Aunt Grace. She had called to tell us that Uncle Harry had passed away that morning. She had been trying to call my mom. She was picking us up from school. My mom turned to me and put me on the phone with my aunt. I told her what happened and she said that it was my Uncle Harry saying one last goodbye. Ever since that day, my mom and my mom and her side of the family, never doubted when I saw or heard something ever again. My experience was something that I can't explain. When I was about 3 or 4 years old, I lived in a small apartment. For my personal privacy, I'm not going to say where. Smiley face. First, I'll tell you some little details. It was midsummer. My room is in a P shape with a door at the bottom of the P. The one window I had was completely closed. I had no pajamas on and I only had underwear on because of the weather, and my mom was in the living room watching TV about to go to bed herself. I was fast asleep when all of a sudden I feel a hand on my back. I was laying on my stomach. I jumped up because I didn't expect to feel a hand on my back. When I looked around my room, I didn't see anything, mostly because my eyes were adjusting to the dark. I got out of bed and walked to the living room where my mom was. She asked why I was still up. I don't know how I responded because it's been 17 years since this happened, and I was 3 or 4 years old at that time. After that, my mom walked me back to my bed, and I slept through the night. Years later, when I was about 15 years old, my mom and I had a conversation about that apartment. She said that in that apartment, very weird things were happening. Some examples are, when my mom was done with showering, she opened the curtain, and when she went back and 5 seconds later, the curtain was closed again. The TV was turning on in the middle of the night. weird clicking noises. We suspected that the house had a poltergeist. And when me and my mom were almost done with our conversation, I thought about it that night, and I can vaguely remember a black mass or shape standing in the corner of my room. But that could be a child's imagination. Why I wanted to write this here is because I still want to know what that could have been. Was it my imagination? Or was it the poltergeist? That's the end of tonight's stories, guys. Hope you guys had as much fun listening as I did reading them. And I just want to point out the one story about the dark lake and being saved from drowning, not only by, your loved one, but when you fell off the counter. I think that was the most neat story of this evening. I hope to read more like that, and if anybody has any stories to submit themselves, know that we are listening to the comments. And submit that story. Let me read it. Might be good. So as usual, see you next time.